and welcome back to the Mindful Education Summit. I'm Dr. Chris Willard, one of your hosts. I myself am a mindfulness author and teacher, educator, as well as a clinical psychologist by training. I'm so excited today to be joined by Dr. Kristin Neff. We'll be talking about resilience and self-compassion. And Dr. Neff has really pioneered so much in this field of self-compassion, both practice and research. She's the co-founder of the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion and the author of a number of books and co-author of a number of books, Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself. And most recently, and I think maybe most hopefully, the book from Guilford, Teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion Program, which is a guide for facilitators interested in really sharing this stuff, you know, in accordance with any other trainings that they may have that she just did with Chris Germer. So thank you so much, Kristin, for being here with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I love this audience, so hi.
Hi. Great. So today, the theme is really going to be resilience. And so to me, self-compassion really has a lot to do with resilience. Can you share a little bit with our audience, I guess, first of all, what is self-compassion? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what it really is. And then also maybe a little bit about how does this build resilience, both in our kids and in teachers and in educators themselves.
Yeah, so self-compassion, thought of simply, is simply treating yourself with the same type of kindness, care, warmth, concern you'd show to a good friend, right? It's being there for yourself, being supportive, not just harshly criticizing yourself all the time. And so that's kind of more the informal definition of it, but my more formal definition is that it entails three components, and you really need all three in order for it to be a stable practice and a full practice. So the first is actually mindfulness, right? You actually need mindfulness at the foundation of self-compassion. You need to turn toward difficulty, right? Compassion, the word passion means suffering. So compassion is always aimed at some sort of suffering, mental, physical, emotional. So when you turn toward that suffering, you need to be mindful of it. If you ignore it and avoid it or resist it, it's going to make it worse and it's not going to be useful. On the other hand, if you run away with it and you get lost in it, that's not helpful either. So the foundation of self-compassion is this mindful, spacious awareness, having the courage to be present with what is, even if what is difficult. So that's kind of the first step temporally, and it kind of plays a role the whole way. But it's not just mindfulness. I mean, mindfulness is a beautiful practice, but mindfulness is just one wing of the bird. You know, there's this idea that mindfulness is one wing and compassion is the other wing. We really need both wings to fly. So once mindful awareness kind of is aware of our difficulty or our struggle, and we kind of hold it without resisting it, then we need to, if I can be colloquial, we need to bring in the love. Right, and that's in two ways. One is a sense of connectedness, realizing that we aren't alone, we aren't the only ones who are imperfect or who are struggling in this way. And of course, that's something we know logically. Everyone realizes that. Of course, I know I'm not the only one feeling this way, or I know no one else is perfect. But emotionally, what happens is in the moment of failure, or the moment when we get that call from the doctor or something happens, we think something has gone wrong, as if it's not supposed to be this way. You know, unconsciously we assume that the way things are supposed to be is perfect. And when they aren't, something has gone wrong. And then what happens, again, if we don't catch it with mindfulness, what happens is we start feeling like, oh, it's just me who's failed, or it's just me who's made a mistake, or it's just me who's struggling with this health issue or this family issue. And that makes us feel cut off and separated from the rest of humanity. And that's that feeling of being cut off and isolated, especially for human beings, is incredibly debilitating, right? Loneliness, I mean, they like to say in evolutionary biology, a lone monkey is a dead monkey, right? For human beings, the feeling like it's just me, I'm weird, I'm different, I'm not normal, everyone else is perfect, it's just me. This really adds a lot of extra add-on suffering to whatever's already happening. But then really, really key is the warmth, right? So bringing in explicit kindness and warmth to ourselves. Now mindfulness, any good mindfulness teacher naturally brings mindfulness in a kind of warm, tender, caring way, and is implicit, is fully there. But self-compassion practice makes this explicit. In this, we kind of turn toward ourselves like we would to a friend. And that actually, by the way, that step of perspective taking is really key, because we step outside of ourselves and say, wow, I'm really having a hard time. What do I need in the moment? And then when we bring feelings of care and concern, gosh, I really care about myself. This is hard. What can I do to help? That feeling of support. I'm not going to abandon myself. I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm going to be there with a supportive attitude. Maybe some constructive suggestions for change are warranted, but I'm not going to just blame myself or shame myself. So when you add in the warmth and the kindness, it makes a big difference. And part of that is, I don't want to get too detailed here, but it changes us physiologically. Compassion taps into the care system, the system that mammals have. For the first couple of years of life, we're born as babies. The only way we communicate with our parents is through touch, by that sense of care. That's how we feel safe. And so what we're doing with self-compassion, especially if we combine it with like touch, some sort of, physical touch and a kind tone of voice and a kind intent, it brings us back to our initial state of feeling safe by feeling connected to others. And that's why, some people think that self-compassion is weak. I can tell you the research shows it's one of the most powerful sources of coping and resilience we have available to us. It's the power of feeling connected and feeling safe and feeling cared for, which gives us tremendous resilience, especially if we're dealing with things like depression, or, maybe you've got eating issues or relationship issues or health issues, whatever your issue is. If you approach your challenge feeling connected and supported and warm towards yourself, it's going to really, really help you cope. It's going to, first of all, lower the extent of distress you're feeling from the pain. It's still painful. It's not like a cure-all, but you aren't exacerbating the pain by basically feeling all alone and judging yourself because of it. And then it gives you the mental and emotional stability, the platform from which to make better decisions. And again, you don't have to believe me, there's a ton of research on this really showing how important it is for coping and resilience.
And that's one of the things I find so exciting about self-compassion is it can sound so kind of wishy-washy, but then you and Chris and so many other folks have done this just tremendous research to really back up how helpful it really is. Yeah. And I think hitting these different points, mindfulness, which we know so much about, but then that sense of common humanity and connection, when we feel burned out or we make a mistake, both educators and kids, right? That shame just wells up, and that
Yes.
that sense of isolation, even in a group. And I heard recently that actually isolation and that sense of social shunning, that's actually hitting a lot of the same areas of the brain that we associate with physical pain. So it really is painful. Yes. And we need that.
It's very, very painful. Yeah. Right. And so again, we absolutely need the mindfulness, but we also need the warmth and connection. We need all of them in order to be our best selves, in order to be our strongest, in order to be our most resilient. And these are things you can explicitly cultivate. So, I'm a researcher, and I've been researching this for almost 20 years now. And, you don't have to convince me. I got the data to show that it works. But what you say, it's so exciting. And I didn't realize that it would be something that's easy to teach people, but it's a lot easier than I thought it would be, right? and the reason I think why it's easier than I thought it would be is because we already know how to do it. We already know how to be warm and caring and supportive. We're that way with our kids, we're that way with our spouses, we're that way with our close friends. Especially with our close friends. Sometimes we aren't always the most caring with our spouses and children. They're a bit too close. But at least, we got our good days and our bad days. But, at least with friends, that's kind of one of the most important skills we've gained as adults is we know how to be there, how to be solid, how to be, committed, how to be caring. We know what to say. If your friend comes home, your close friend comes home and gets a poor work evaluation, you aren't going to say, oh, you're such a stupid idiot, man. I'm so ashamed of you. Yeah. You aren't going to say that. It's funny. We say that to ourselves.
Right.
But we don't say that to our friends. We know with our friends, we say, hey, listen, well, first of all, it's only temporary, it's a one-off, see how it goes. You might say, well, listen, maybe, is there any information you need to learn from this? Maybe some things you can work on, but it doesn't mean that you're a bad person just because some of your work behaviors have, you found that you need some improvement, right? We know how to do that instinctually.
Right.
So all we're doing is giving ourselves permission to be that way with ourselves. It's really not rocket science. I mean, by age 7, kids, peer development, that's kind of what they're doing. They're learning how to be a good friend. They're learning what that means. And so the only missing link is that U-turn of turning that friendship and that support and that kindness and care inward and giving it to ourselves. And once you learn how to do it, I do have to say, it feels kind of weird at first. It does. I mean, you say like,
oh yeah,
gosh, this is really hard for me. It feels like, what? I'm not used to it. You get used to that. You get used to that, and then once you get over the slight weird factor of it, you think, wow, I feel so much better when I let myself know that I'm here for myself and I'm not going to abandon myself and I'm going to care for and support myself and I'm going to ask, what do I need? And, once you get over that kind of cultural hump of not giving it to yourself, it's really not that hard.
Yeah. And I think, again, for educators who know how to care for kids, right? Yes. It's like, can you do this? You turn on yourself. And in that way, also reminding them, too, that this is what they're trying to teach kids. I hear that I heard recently that critical voice starts to develop in kids around like age 9 or 10 or so. And can we start to really teach them, oh, can you build that compassionate voice? Can you cultivate that compassionate voice in yourself? And as you said, it still leads to high standards and getting things done and all of that. It's just we do it without that self-criticism that can be so toxic.
But it's funny because it used to be our education philosophy as well, and our parenting philosophy. I mean, 200 years ago, if you were a teacher, you'd have the rod, you'd have the paddle. Right. And, people really believed for their kids, for their students, that they needed to be harsh and tough to make the kids strong and resilient. And now we know so much more. We realize that actually what that does is when you shame someone or you harm them physically or emotionally, that what happens is it actually destabilizes someone. It makes them nervous. It gives them performance anxiety. They don't feel good inside. They doubt themselves. They undermine their own ability to achieve their best. And so, teachers, I guess I am a teacher. I'm a professor. So we know how to do it, right? So you have to, it doesn't mean you're like, oh, whatever, you didn't turn in your work. Oh, that's okay, darling. That's not being a good teacher. That's like not at all being a good teacher. A good teacher has high standards and says, listen, this is what needs to change. But a good teacher says, here's what we need to do to change. How can I help you? How can I support you to learn? We can do the exact same things with ourselves. We fail at something, instead of thinking I'm a failure, it's like, oh, okay, well, this is an opportunity to see what I might be able to do better next time. It's not that I'm bad. It's just that, for whatever reason, I didn't know how to do it correctly, and I will try again.
Right.
And the thing is, again, with a good teacher, the bottom line with a good teacher is, even if a kid fails, as long as they're trying, you still care for that kid. Right. Right. So funny, my son, and I think many people may know my son's autistic, and I had homeschooled him most of his life, and he's just going to public school now. And, he loves school. He loves his teachers, but he has trouble taking tests. He's not used to it. It's just challenging for him with his, with his brain. And he came home with a failing world geography test. And it's so funny because I always tell the story about, would you say that to your kid? And it really struck me, like, and I just so instinctually knew how to help him. How to give him, it's fine. People fail. It's okay, sweetie. Don't worry about it. It's a learning experience. But of course, I went and I talked to his teachers and I figured out different ways to test them. And that's what you do when you really care. Right. And so we can use that well-honed, well-developed skill, and it is a skill. And we can just turn it toward ourselves. And it's amazing the difference it makes. It's just night and day. It really is.
I think of it as almost as like developing our own, there's the authoritarian parent, the permissive parent, and the
Yes.
authoritative parent. And it's
Yes.
really like, can you create your own
Yes.
inner
It's
authoritative voice?
authoritative.
Like,
Be your own authoritative parent.
permissive
Yeah,
thing, but it's
exactly.
not, in
Yeah.
fact. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things I've always appreciated about your research is talking a bit about self-compassion compared to self-esteem, which is, people are looking at, sort of the self-esteem generation,
Right.
some of the pluses and maybe minuses of raising our kids with a self-esteem mindset that of course creates more of a fixed mindset and all of that. Can you talk about the difference between these things and where you feel like self-compassion is such an important thing to really be cultivating, maybe even more than self-esteem?
Yeah, no, I actually do think it's more important to intentionally cultivate self-compassion than self-esteem, because self-esteem is a natural byproduct of self-compassion.
Mm.
But the type of self-worth linked to self-compassion is unconditional, right? So if you're a human being worthy of care and respect, you will have high self-esteem as opposed to low self-esteem, but the source is stable because you have it when you succeed and you fail. So that's one of the problems with self-esteem for many people is contingent. It's contingent on success, how you look, how popular you are at the moment. It kind of deserts you when you fail, which is just when you need it. The other problem with self-esteem is that it tends to be comparative, right? I only feel good about myself if I'm better than someone else. We all have to feel above average to feel okay about ourselves, which is logically impossible, which means we play, all sorts of strange mind games in order for us to feel like I'm special, which means I'm better than someone else. And then if someone else does better than us, instead of like supporting them, we feel badly about ourselves. And so self-compassion, because it's just based on this idea that we are all just flawed human beings doing our best. We're all intrinsically worthy of care because we're human beings. You don't have to like earn the right to have compassion. All living beings, and I would include animals in this personally, are worthy of care and compassion, right? And by the way, I'm not going off on a sidetrack, but I mean, you think how upset we get, like cruelty to animals, right?
Right.
We really get, because we know that this is a sentient being that needs care and we shouldn't harm them. And so it's not based on being better than anyone else. It's just based on being a human being. So for instance, we know that one of the reasons kids start to bully in early middle school is because they're trying to feel good about themselves. They're trying to get a sense of self-esteem. If I can pick on that kid and feel like I'm the cool kid or something like that. And actually, sadly, in the early adolescent years, as you know, that it actually does kind of help people like successful bullies who get away with it. And then after, with maturity, it tends to decrease. But you don't have to be better than anyone else to have self-compassion.
Right.
So it's just a much more stable source of self-worth. It's not linked to these negative effects like ego, aggression. When someone insults you, doesn't mean you're going to lash out at them because your ego is pricked. You can have, oh, that really hurt. That really hurt.
Right.
You can give yourself what you need in the moment. And so, yeah, and that's why I think for youth especially is so important. And there's a lot of great research coming out now. A meta-analysis just came out with a lot of studies with youth, adolescents, showing that it's a very important resilience factor for teens. We also know how to teach it to teens. We actually have a teen version of our mindful self-compassion program called Making Friends with Yourself. Very similar, it's just a little more fun, a little shorter. Yeah, and teens really seem to like it. So because it's so needed.
Right.
So needed.
Right. Can you fill us in a little bit on that? Like how can educators start to, begin to bring this to kids? They can learn a little bit about MSC. They can learn a little bit about MFY, then Make Friends with Yourself. Like, can you give us a few examples of what's maybe in that program, or how to even begin to language this for some of the maybe more skeptical teens in a classroom, or hide it in their curriculum somehow?
Yeah, well, so first of all, you don't have to use the word self-compassion. It's a little bit of an awkward word. I know some people say, why did you call it self-compassion? And it's like, well, because I could have called it inner compassion, it's a little clumsy, you know, but it's really self-compassion is not about the self.
Right.
It's actually just the opposite. It's about including yourself in the circle so you're less separated from others.
Yeah.
So you don't have to call it, you know, self-compassion if you don't like the word. You can just talk about the importance of being supportive to yourself, of being helpful to yourself, right? I think one of the best ways of approaching it with kids is to talk about being a good friend to yourself. So one very simple thing you can do is just with your students or your kids, just ask them to compare how they do treat their friends and themselves when things are difficult. You know, you can ask, they say, okay, have you ever had a friend come to you who was upset about something or maybe feeling badly about themselves? You know, what types of things do you say to your friends, and you know, what tone of voice do you use? How do you act toward them to make them feel cared for and supportive? And you know, they'll usually have some idea of that. And then you can say, well, you know, how do you treat yourself when you fail or you're doing badly, or you know, or something, you're having a struggle in class or something like that. And then you can also turn it the other way. You can think, well, what you say to yourself, imagine if you said that to your friend. What impact do you think would have on your friend, right? So you can use this perspective taking. I mean, before about 7, it's not going to work so well before two-way operations set in. But after about 7, you can use this perspective taking skill that kids naturally have to work with, you know, what's the best way to support myself, to care for myself when I'm struggling. And again, it's really not that difficult. Once you just get into it. You can also teach about the 3 components of self-compassion. You can just talk about the fact that, first of all, we got to pay attention to when we're having a hard time. If we don't notice that we're really upset, you know, if we're just getting, you know, lost in how upset we are, that's going to not be very helpful. So just, you know, notice when you're upset. Remember that things going, you know, having trouble as part of life. Everyone's imperfect. You know, life doesn't always go perfectly. It's just part of life. And really, you know, the kindness. What do you need to be kind to yourself right now?
Yeah.
And so we have something in the workbook called the self-compassion break. I also have it on my website, which basically does just help people remember the 3 components: mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness. And then touch is also really helpful. I mean, it kind of depends on the context. It could look a little funny. It may be good to like slip in with some information about the parasympathetic nervous system because it is rooted in the fact that we're mammals. As mammals, we respond very well to touch. I mean, babies, they come out of the womb, first couple of years, they have no language. The way the parents communicate, you're safe, you're cared for, is by touch, right? Stroking. And so you can actually find a touch for yourself that, you know, feels good, hands on heart, or holding your face, or holding your hand, or some sort of physical touch. And you can just invite people just to notice how their body feels when they do that, you know. And then, so actually what's happening physiologically is you're activating the parasympathetic nervous system. You're increasing heart rate variability, you're lowering cortisol, you're actually changing your physiological state, which also helps to facilitate the emotional change as well.
Right. Right. You're getting a little science lesson in there at the same time.
You know, why not? Why not?
But I find,
you know, you can show a cute little picture of like puppies. You know, people, why do people love puppies? It's the mammalian care system, you know?
Right.
And
everyone goes, oh, right, and gets it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What about in terms of like little kids, trying to teach them self-compassion versus teens and adolescents? I know you mentioned some of the developmental challenges just around perspective taking, but do you have more thoughts about that you might want to share, things that you've seen in the research?
Yeah, so we haven't developed a training program for young children, and I'm just too busy. There's a few good books on my website, recommended books like picture books for young kids. And again, they also have to do with being a good friend to yourself. I think this one great one called, you know, Be My Own Best Friend, something like that.
Oh yeah, Sarah Marlowe.
And so, you know, I mean, the good thing is as long as everything's fairly okay in the home environment, typically kids have a fairly strong positivity bias. It's usually not till like late childhood, early adolescence that the identity issues start coming in, the self-esteem issues start coming in, the self-doubt. So I'm not so sure like we need a full-on intervention program for young
Mhm.
children. I don't know, that may be different for young kids who come with trauma histories. I mean, there's a lot to be developed here.
Right.
And, you know, and I suspect that teachers or clinicians who work with young kids in difficulty, what they do is they just model a ton of compassion for the children, which we know how important it is. But really just, you know, using examples, just saying, hey, you know, is that a very, you know, how might you say that in a way that's a little nicer, a little kinder, a little more supportive, or, you know, again, I don't know the full answer to that, but I don't think it's going to be that difficult. I think if you
Yeah.
already know basically where your kids are at and where they are in terms of peer development, then you can draw on that. You know?
Yeah.
But I would love for someone to take it on. I really would. I just don't have time, but
Right.
I'm not the best person. It's not my area.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned this idea of modeling and the
Yeah.
importance of modeling.
Yeah.
Uh, can you say a little bit more about that? Do
Yes.
teachers need to be practicing self-compassion either formally or informally to start to try to teach this, or other educators, therapists, parents? Do you feel like that's important? That's a big one in the mindfulness world. Got to have a practice to teach a practice. Do you feel like that's true in self-compassion, and why or why not?
Yes. Well, I do think it's very important to have your own self-compassion practice. Now,
Mhm.
you know, you don't need to meditate to learn self-compassion. You just have to cultivate a compassionate mindset, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so, first of all, self-compassion, I actually taught some self-compassion to teachers. It's really good for
Mhm.
teachers for dealing with
Yeah.
the stress of the job and dealing with all the empathic distress you pick up from working with your kids who are often very troubled, you know, especially depending on where you're teaching. There's often a lot of pain in the room, right? And if you're a good empathetic teacher, you're going to feel your kids' pain and it's going to affect you. So it's really important for your own resilience to make sure that you mindfully acknowledge, wow, this is hard, I'm feeling it, or feeling like overwhelmed or helpless, you know, I don't know what to do in this situation. And so being mindful of your own struggle and then remembering your common humanity, you know, this is hard for everyone. You know, it's hard to be a teacher. It's hard to deal with situations like this. It's not just me. And
Mhm.
then really give yourself some kindness. You know, I taught the teachers just to breathe in, imagine they were just breathing in compassion for themselves when they were with their kids, you know, breathing in compassion for yourself. And then you can breathe out compassion for your students as well. So it's not just one way, but just always to include yourself. And so the cool thing is other people resonate with our mental mind state, right? So if
Right.
we're frustrated and irritated, we may try to hide it, but other people can pick up on it, you know, especially through their mirror neurons.
Right.
But when our internal mind state is calmer and more compassionate and more warm, if we have more warmth internally, other people are going to pick up on that, including our students and our colleagues, and, you know, parents or whoever. So it's good at that level to practice to help you cope. But I also think it's good to model it explicitly, you know, so if you're a teacher and you make a mistake, right? So I do this and I teach my mindful self-compassion programs, you know, if I make a mistake and, you know, and I still do make mistakes, not quite as often as I used to, thank goodness, but I still do. And then you just use that as a teaching moment,
Right.
you know, hey, it's, oh, well, first of all, just acknowledging that hurts, you know, but you know, no one's perfect. This
Mhm.
happens, and you know, can I really just be here for myself in this moment? And so if you drop a glass or something, instead of saying, "Oh, I'm such an idiot," you know, I think often like we criticize ourselves in front of others because we're hoping they'll kind of like us. We're hoping that
Mhm.
they'll forgive us. If I beat myself up, maybe that person will forgive me, you
Right.
know. And so, but that's not really good. But that's how we get in this mutual pack of we're all beating ourselves up and no one's helping each other.
Right.
Now you don't have to ignore it. It's like I didn't drop the glass. It must be your fault. You know, you don't want to do that.
Right.
But just
Right.
taking responsibility and saying, "Hey, it's human. You know, what can I do differently?" Or something. If you actually model having a more mature self-compassionate reaction to a mistake you made, it helps you, but it also helps other people by
Yeah.
modeling that.
And I think, I mean, there's actually this very cool study, I can't pull it out from the top of my head, but something about it's from like the growth mindset kind of
Yeah.
research that I feel actually, I did a little bit of writing about where self-compassion and growth mindset actually overlap, which is,
Yes.
there's a lot there. But
Yeah.
that like if teachers go like deliberately teaching teachers to make a mistake, to screw up a math problem, notice their mistake, give them, do out loud healthy self-talk in front of
Yes.
those kids, right? That's actually so good for those
Yeah.
kids in terms of them taking healthy risks and making mistakes that they can
Right.
learn from. And it's like,
Exactly.
yeah, that's it.
And that it's okay to make mistakes, and it's totally fine.
Right,
And when we make mistakes, we just, we give ourselves warmth
right.
and unconditional support, and we help ourselves learn from our mistakes.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, it's so funny, a lot of people get that wrong. They think self-compassion means ignoring your mistakes or making excuses. The research shows just the opposite, right? So for instance, one study, they had people think about something from the past, something they did in the past that they really regretted. And then they gave like some people a self-compassion condition, like they had them write about their experience with mindfulness and kindness and common humanity. And another group of people, they gave them a self-esteem condition. You write about all the great things about yourself. And then they they tested them to see like how willing were they to apologize for those mistakes, or to try to make amends, or to think about repairing what happened. And self-compassion increased taking responsibility for your mistakes and wanting to repair them more than self-esteem. It
Wow.
makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And when I, as a therapist and, an educational consultant also, I hear so many parents and so many teachers being like, this kid can't take responsibility, they're struggling. And also, often it's the adults who are struggling to take responsibility
Yeah.
too, and not modeling that. But again, I mean, I love that research that it's like, no, this doesn't make you all wishy-washy, and like the permissive self-parenting, it
Yeah,
really
that's not compassionate.
takes more
Permissive parenting is not
responsibility. Right,
compassionate parenting, because
right.
it's hard to take responsibility.
Yeah,
But you can't take responsibility unless you have the strength to hold the pain,
right,
right? The pain
right.
of, whatever you're feeling, maybe you feel guilty, you feel badly, whatever it is.
Yeah,
If you don't have that kind of warm, supportive space of saying, wow, I feel so badly, that really hurts. And I am only human. I made a mistake. What can I do to repair this, to try to repair the situation? Otherwise, it's too big and you just can't
right,
go there. You either
right,
shut it out. You can't go there. You can't think about it. You disassociate, or you try to blame someone else because it's
right,
emotionally comfortable.
right.
So
And even the order that you have it, it's like first you validate, right? It's like what I learned as a therapist. First you validate, then you offer intervention of try
yeah.
this next differently. But
Well,
it's like,
that's really the mindfulness. That's
yourself
really
up
why
first. Yeah.
the kind of function of mindfulness and self-compassion is well, it's actually two forms. One is to validate the pain,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then also, if it's in terms of taking action, it's more this clear seeing.
Right.
What went wrong? What needs to change? It's that real
Right.
clarity. And then sometimes it means speaking up.
Right.
Sometimes
Right.
self-compassion means saying no. This is
Mm-hmm.
not working for me. Or I disagree. That also comes from mindfulness. So mindfulness really is fully interwoven with self-compassion. But
Right.
again, I'm going to say it again, mindfulness alone isn't enough. It's one
Mhm.
wing of the bird. We
Yeah.
also need the warmth and the connectedness and the kindness. Otherwise, it's just not a stable
Right.
being.
Right. Right. So is there any research also on how does this affect learning or performance or outcomes in terms of not just mental health, which I think are out there, but in terms of learning in the classroom and that kind of
Yeah,
thing?
so there's not a lot of research on it. There's very little in the classroom itself, which
Mm-hmm.
it'd be nice to change. We're actually going to be starting. We're working with I think mindful schools. We're going to bring
Mm-hmm.
self-compassion training to teachers, and hopefully we can start doing more research once we do that. So there is work, as you'd expect. It's linked to intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic motivation.
Right.
Linked to learning goals as opposed to performance goals, linked to a growth mindset. It doesn't seem to be that self-compassion leads to better grades. No, it's not a lot of research on it. There's a tiny bit. What I've seen, it's not the case. And I think that's partly because, in the short term, self-criticism does kind of work. I mean, there's a lot of people who put themselves through, law school through harsh self-criticism.
Yeah.
It's not like it doesn't work, and it actually can spur you to achieve. It's just that it has all these unintended consequences that are going to get you in the long run, like stress, like overwhelm, like, heart disease.
Lawyers are the most unhappy profession.
Yeah, or being really unhappy, or, and it does create performance anxiety. So again, it doesn't thrill everyone. There's plenty of people who do, you might say, well, success-wise, with their self-criticism approach to motivation, but it does have unhealthy consequences in the long run.
Right.
It's less sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah. And how about in terms of, that there's all this kind of talk lately, at least in my world, around mindfulness and compassion and kindness and self-compassion fitting in with what gets categorized as social emotional learning, emotional intelligence, social intelligence. Is there much kind of that people are finding on whether kids or adults about social engagement and empathy and things like that with others?
Yeah, well, so it's kind of interesting. Though it hasn't been a lot of research. I'm interested in kind of parsing out some of the differences and overlap, of course, between self-compassion and other compassion. And so it's interesting. The social emotional learning programs tend to focus more on compassion for others. Now, some are starting to include self-compassion, but I hate to say this. Please don't throw rocks at me. You can't, because you're on video. Compassion for others doesn't really help your own mental health. Research doesn't find a strong link between being compassionate to others and things like anxiety or depression or, again, personal well-being. And as a matter of fact, there are many people, you probably know some, who are very compassionate to others. But they beat themselves up and they're like a nervous wreck, but they're such kind people to others.
Many educators, many therapists, yeah.
Yes, exactly. But so self-compassion, inner compassion is, I think, really the much more powerful trait to have in terms of your own personal well-being. But for interpersonal well-being, for things like, forgiveness or good relationships, compassion for others, of course, is absolutely key.
Right.
So, and of course, self-compassion helps you maintain compassion for others without burning out.
Right.
So they're linked, but I think to just teach compassion for others without including the self is a problem. I do.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't really help that much, and it does lead to things like burnout.
Right.
Now, of course, some of this research is a problem because it's based on self-report, and people like, I actually just published a compassion for others scale a couple weeks ago, it got accepted. Because on a 5-point scale, most people are like 4.5. And then you look at the world and you think, I'm not so sure about that. Because what happens is they'd like to see themselves that way, but when push comes to shove or something threatens them or talking about outgroup members, it's not so much. So, again, you don't want to put too much faith in the self-report research. But I think basically it's all needed. It's all needed.
Right.
And I think social and emotional learning is starting to change. Positive psychology, at first I didn't really talk about my work, I think because it's aimed at suffering and they're about being positive.
Right.
Now, because really what self-compassion is it's a positive mind state aimed at suffering. You hold the suffering or the pain or the difficulty, feelings of inadequacy in a loving, connected presence. That's another way to talk about the three components. Kindness is loving, common humanity is connected, and mindfulness is presence. And I like that term because it gives you more of a felt sense of what it feels like in your self-compassionate state of mind, loving, connected presence. So we hold our pain in loving, connected presence. And the pain, first of all, it helps reduce the pain pretty much because we're lessening our resistance to it, right? But it's also, what you can actually do is you can actually learn to rest your awareness in the loving, connected presence that's holding the pain. So I used to do this with my son, right? By the way, my son now, he's like easiest kid in the world. He's like happy. I have no problems. I have nothing to complain about anymore. When he's little,
what are you gonna write another book about?
Challenge. He'd have these outrageous tantrums, and but I was doing all this self-compassion work. And so sometimes he would be having like a horrible fit, or, just really, it's really disturbing. And I would actually I would just flood myself and him with compassion.
Yeah.
And so instead of your mind being lost in the pain itself, you actually learn to, the love and care and the kindness that's holding the pain. And when you put your awareness there, it's actually kind of a positive state of being. It's kind of, bittersweet. There's something fulfilling about it. Well, and we know that in the brain, right? So compassion activates the reward centers.
Mm-hmm.
We feel love and connection and presence. Those are actually positive emotions.
Right.
So I think that's why self-compassion or compassion for others, they're kind of unique emotions because it's positive, aimed directly at negative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of it's both at the same time.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, as we wrap up, I don't know if there's anything else you'd want to add, or if we could be so bold as to ask you to lead us in a practice that kids or educators might resonate with.
Yeah, I can lead a self-compassion break. I talked about that. I can lead one right now if you want. And I've got an MP3 of it on my website, and it's actually written on my website too. So if any teachers want to practice it and lead their kids through it, you can try it.
And what is your website? Could you give us your website?
Just Google self-compassion, you'll find me. I got in early in the market, so I've kind of those algorithms. I'll rotate on the ground website. So. Yeah. Okay. All right. So why don't you go ahead and close your eyes, and anyone who's watching this, just close your eyes. Okay, and just call to mind something that's troubling you right now. Something in your life, maybe a health issue or a relationship issue or a work issue. Something that's some struggle. But please don't think of something overwhelmingly difficult, because we know we can't actually learn when we're overwhelmed. Something that's bothering you, that's maybe a 4 or a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of how stressful or difficult it is. All right, and so just call that situation to mind. Remember what's going on and how you're feeling with the various people who are involved, if there is someone else involved. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say some phrases that bring to us the 3 components of self-compassion. And then I'd like the listener to actually think of words that work better for them to really express the same sentiment, but in their own language that makes sense. Okay, so again, thinking about the situation. So first, remembering that, this is a moment of suffering or difficulty. Right? We're bringing our mindfulness in, we're validating. This is hard. It's hard to have this experience. Okay, so again, using any words that work for you, maybe just ouch, or just validate the challenge or the struggle, the stress. And then remembering our common humanity, right? So difficulty, struggle, pain, it's a part of life, right? It's a part of life. So, we aren't alone. People are struggling with different things, and maybe the intensity of the struggle is different. But everyone struggles. It's part of being a human. And then finally, we want to bring ourselves some support and kindness. Actually, one way to do that is by using some sort of supportive touch. You can put maybe your hands on your heart or your stomach or your cheeks, right? Some touch. It kind of just lets us know we're here, we care. And thinking of kind and supportive words you can say to yourself right now about this situation. And one way to think of that, maybe, imagine if you had a really dear friend who was going through the exact same situation you were. What would you probably say to care for and support your friend? Thinking of what that might be. And then try it on with yourself. See if you can give yourself that same understanding and support and kindness. Okay, and then when you're ready, you can open your eyes, right? And just to acknowledge, people have different reactions to a practice like that. Some people, will find it soothing, comforting. Other people, it actually sometimes can make us feel a little more agitated. We've got this saying, when you open your heart, like the love rushes in, but often the pain rushes out. And so sometimes it can actually be a little activating to practice self-compassion. There's no reflection on how you're doing it or whether you're doing it right. It just might mean that some pain's coming out that needs a little healing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kristin. What a beautiful practice. And I think so many educators are going to find that so helpful. It's one that I use often in my own busy day and challenging life. That self-compassion break is so powerful. So thank you again, Dr. Kristin Neff, psychologist, researcher, author of a number of wonderful books and creator of the absolutely wonderful Mindful Self-Compassion Program and the new book, Teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion Program with Dr. Chris Germer. So thank you again so much, and please
thank you. Thank you. See you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.